Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 31. 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 31. And today I am going to be reading from the NIV. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 31. And now here's the reading of God's word. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. The intelligent of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demanded signs and Greeks looked for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Paul is writing the letter to the Corinthian church while he is in Ephesus. And as he is in Ephesus, he started hearing about some of the things that's happening in the church in Corinth. And things that he heard were not positive. He had heard about the tension that existed within the church. There were divisions within the church at Corinth. Not in our passage today, but in verse 12, Paul says this, what I mean is that each of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. In another translation, they use the language of, I am of Paul, of Apollos, of Cephas, of Christ. You see, there were some in the church aligning with one leader, while another would align with a different leader. There is no indication that the leaders promoted this behavior. There's no indication that the leader said, hey, I want you guys to follow me. This was all done by the followers. The problem was that they placed great emphasis on the one whom they followed. For those who say, I follow Paul, they hold this position. Man, Paul is the one who came here, don't you remember? He's the one who gave us the word, and he's the reason why we are in this situation. I follow Paul because Paul is the greatest. While others will say about Apollos, Cephas. And then there's a fourth group who say, you know what, forget all human beings. I am of Christ. I follow Christ. The root problem in all of this was not so much that the people were showing their faith. It actually was revealing their pride. Pride to say, you know what, I follow Paul. You guys are following the wrong person. I am of Paul. By stating that they followed Apollos, they're not saying that Apollos was great, but they're saying that they are great for following him. The focus and everything was all inward. It's almost like a self-promotion. The divisions within the church were troublesome and problematic. And Paul makes it clear that divisions are contrary to Christ and the gospel. Paul points out that Jesus doesn't belong to any one particular group or one particular party. Paul wasn't crucified for them, he says. He asked him in a rhetorical question, was I crucified for you? No. Were you baptized in Paul's name? No. Then why in the world are you aligning and saying, I follow Paul? And the same could be true. Were you baptized in Apollos, Cephas? No. Why are you aligning yourselves with these various groups and causing this division within the church? Paul says, and he reminds them, I was sent to preach the gospel. It is a message of the gospel that he focuses on in our text today, in verse 18 and on. And in this section, what we see happening is that Paul is dividing the world into two groups of people. Those who are perishing and those who are being saved. And depending on which group you belong to, the response to the message of the cross is different. There is an important component of the cross that we have to understand. Because you and I, we look at the cross and we see something different than what the first century would see, what those in the first century would have seen. So let me lay down a foundation of the view of the cross in this time period so that we can understand why he says in verse 18, for the message of the cross is foolishness for those who are perishing. The first point this morning is this, that the cross was a symbol of shameful crimes. The image of the cross was very different for the people of Paul's day than it is for us today. The Romans continued to use the cross as a means of public execution, even during Paul's day. We know that it was common in the time before Jesus even. And during Jesus, we know that he was crucified. And when he was crucified with two criminals. So that method continues on into the time of Paul. The cross, in that time, the cross was a symbol of death. The people of the first century had a very different view of the cross than you and I do. To us, it's jewelry. To us, it's a decorative work. To us, it's something that we might even put onto the wall. Right? This would be unthinkable for them in the first century because the cross was a method of execution. It was a cruel death. It was designed to inflict maximum shame, maximum pain, and maximum cruelty. I remember as I was studying this passage in seminary, I remember my professor said that archaeologists have discovered and they have seen and they've studied the method of the crucifixion. And one of the methods that they found was that in the large beam of the cross, not the cross beam, but the major beam, in the first century, later on, they began to notice that the crosses were built with a little seat. And they thought, why are we all of a sudden noticing images and discovery and the descriptions of the crucifixion? Why are we all of a sudden seeing this seat on the main portion, the horizontal portion of the cross? They concluded that it was designed so that the person who was crucified would choose to sit. And then they began to explore why. It was the cruelty of the cross. The Romans had perfected the art of the crucifixion. Think about it. You're hanging on the cross, and the method of death on the cross was usually by suffocation. Because as the weight it begins to pull down on your body, you are no longer able to breathe. That's how you die. That was a very common method. Oh man, here, let me sit down for a while. Thus prolonging the agony, the death, the cruelty of the cross. That was the image of the cross in the first century. Capital punishment used to execute criminals. Maximum pain, maximum suffering, maximum humiliation. Why? Because those who are crucified usually hung on the cross naked. And above their head on the cross would be the crimes in which they are being executed for. It was an excruciating and a slow death. And oftentimes, in order to speed up the death, they would break the legs. And we saw that happen in the account of the crucifixion of Jesus. They break the legs of the two criminals that are crucified next to him, but when they come to Jesus, they notice he's already dead. Therefore, his legs are not broken. Why? Because they're going up against the start of the Sabbath. They're like, quickly, get this thing done with. So those are the images of the cross. The cross was a shameful event used to execute criminals. There was nothing glorious about the cross. The cross was not a pleasant image. It is this backdrop that Paul leads, where he is referring to in our passage. He's saying it's with this backdrop that people say, you know what? There's nothing glorious about the cross. It is a shameful event. The message of the cross is foolishness, he says, for those who are perishing. The response to the cross has significant impact on which group one person is in. Paul tells us that there is two messages or two responses to the message of the cross. One, the message of the cross is an offense to unbelievers. Now, we understand why Paul says this, knowing the background of the cross and the imagery and understanding. Paul says that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. And given the background view of the cross, I think this is understandable. One commentator says this: the words message of the cross sound kind of noble and religious to our 20th century ears. But in the first century, saying message of the cross was about the same as saying the message of the electric chair, except worse. What message does a cruel, humiliating, unrelenting instrument of death have? No wonder it's foolishness to those who are perishing. In Paul's day, the Greeks and the Romans believed in many kinds of gods, right? Yet the cross, the message of the cross, they rejected it. Why did they reject it? Because the message of the cross, that Jesus was crucified and died, but rose again, the idea of being saved through the work of a crucified man, to them was foolish. People just could not accept it. To the Romans and the Greeks, Jesus was crucified like a common criminal. What is there to worship in that? What kind of God is that to worship? They had so many other choices. They had so many other options, much stronger gods. Why place faith? Why trust? Why worship in a God that was so-called crucified? The Jews are offended by the message of the cross. The Greeks are offended by the message of the cross. The Romans are offended by the message of the cross. The Jews wanted a sign from heaven. They wanted God to prove himself. They wanted Jesus to prove himself. Religious leaders routinely ask Jesus for a sign from heaven. One such example is in Matthew chapter 12, verse 38. One day, some teachers of religious law and the Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, we want you to show us a miraculous sign to prove your authority." Show us a miracle sign. Show us a miraculous sign to show and to prove your authority. Your authority to do all the things that you're doing. Your authority to continue to confront us. Your authority. Show us. They wanted signs. The Jews were looking for a political leader who would deliver them from the rule of the Roman Empire. They were looking for someone powerful to come and save them. Crucifixion doesn't align with what they were looking for. They could never imagine the crucified Messiah. Not only was the cross the image of the cross for them. Not only was it a shameful event reserved for criminals, but the Messiah for them, dying, being crucified, no way. There's no way that they could accept that. There are very strong reactions to the cross. And in the first century, the cross, the imagery of the cross, Paul says, is foolishness to those who are perishing. And the word translated foolishness in 1 Corinthians 1 is a Greek word, moria, or moros. Can you imagine, can you think of which English word we get from that? The message of the cross, what Paul is saying is this. In the Greek, he uses a very strong language. What he's saying is the message of the cross is moronic to those who are perishing. To them, it's pure idiocy. Because in their mind, the image of the cross and all that it represents, and the message of the cross, there's just no way. The message of the cross is offensive to unbelievers. What's the second thing? What's the second response to the message of the cross? The message of the cross is the power of God. What does he say? For those who are being saved. To those who are being saved, the response is different. The cross is the power of God. The cross is God's most powerful act. Death could not keep Jesus down. Death was defeated. Satan thought that he had finally come up with a method, that he was victorious. He rejoiced, he celebrated, but it was very short-lived, wasn't it? On the third day, Jesus rose from the dead. This is the message of the cross. To those who are being saved, it is the ultimate demonstration of God's power. It covered over the sins of those who were perishing. It made a way for all humanity. Those who trust in Jesus, they understand that without this powerful act of God, they will be lost without hope. They will be perishing. They would not be saved. Those who trust in Jesus, they understand that without this powerful act of God, they will be lost and without hope. For through the cross there is hope, there is love, there is power. We look at the same image, hear the same message, and you draw two very distinct conclusions. It's interesting, don't you think? It's not that it's to trick. There are some images where you look and you see one thing, and somebody else next to you can look and see a completely different image. Because the artist has kind of blended it in, right? Or there's certain hidden images within certain things. I love it when Timothy and Abby discover new things, and they come and they tell us. One of the times they're like, hey, do you know that there is an arrow within the FedEx logo? I'm like, oh, no way, there isn't. And they point it out. They're like, it's right here. I'm like, I don't see it. They're like, it's right there. I'm like, I don't see it. Where's the arrow? Point it to me. And they will go and just point the arrow, draw it out. It's like, oh, now I see it. It's amazing that we can look at the same thing and draw two complete and vastly different conclusions. That's, in a sense, what's happening. The cross produces two completely different responses. It's either offensive or it is the power of God. It is either offensive, it's offensive because it says what? The foolishness of the cross. The foolishness of the cross. For those who are perishing, is simple foolishness. But to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. The message of the cross doesn't appeal to the Jews who demanded signs, and to the Greeks who, they sought wisdom. There was no wisdom for them in the cross. What wisdom does the cross have? It's an instrument of death. It's an instrument of shame. What wisdom can one get from the cross? Paul is saying that to those who believe, the message of the cross holds extraordinary power. Look at verses 27 through 29. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. Although the world may view Christians as foolish for believing in the message of the cross, that is not the case. As I was reading an article this past week, one of the pastors who was writing the article was talking about, there's a time. I forget where he was, but he started striking up a conversation with somebody. And then the conversation turned to what it normally does when you meet someone. What do you do for a living? Oh, well, I'm a pastor. Then they started having dialogue. And he said the moment he brought up the message of the cross, the other person said, that's pure lunacy. And the pleasant conversation that started at that point turned into guys standing up and walking away. That's the response to the cross sometimes we encounter. And it's that response that actually kind of keeps us from sharing the message of the cross, isn't it? The world may view Christians as foolish for believing in the message of the cross. But in truth, Christians are the ones who see clearly. They are the ones who see clearly enough to receive what is actually wise and strong. Christians are able to see the power of God in his act of love. To the world, the unbelieving world, it was foolishness to believe such a message. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. For the unbeliever, the cross is shame. It is an offense. For the Christian, however, the cross is the power of God. I want to go back to verse 12. And the verb tense is very important for us to understand in verse 12. It is these words, are perishing and are being saved. This describes a work that is in progress. Are perishing, are being saved. It shows me that I am not a finished product by any means. I think sometimes we want to believe that we should be at a certain place. And when we're not there, when we fall short of that, we kind of beat ourselves up a little bit. We're not there yet. We're finished, we're a work in progress. But it also shows us that we're moving in one of these two directions. You're either in the camp of those who are perishing or those who are being saved. The message of the cross may seem foolish for many. But those who believe that, those who see it that way, clearly are aligning into one or two groups that Paul is describing. Those who are perishing or those who are being saved. In verse 25, Paul says that for the foolishness of the world is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. One thing we want to note in verse 25 is that God doesn't have foolishness or weaknesses. Paul is simply just continuing on to using the description of what's going on to say to make a point that even if God has foolishness or weakness, even if he did, he doesn't, but even if he did, God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. And his weaknesses is still stronger than any human strength. The cross is foolishness or the power of God. Let me invite the worship team up. The cross is foolishness or the cross is the power of God. You are either moving in one of two directions. You are perishing or you are being saved. And our response to the message of cross is very important. as we respond in song this morning to the words that the Lord has impressed upon our hearts. Cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But for those who are being saved, it is the power of God. Which is it for you?